Hi, this is +3. You can use its toggle switch as an instant drone mode. In this mode, its momentary switch lets you swap out held notes for other ones. When not holding notes, its momentary sustain switch gives you desktop control to unlock expression and timbres in the same way a foot pedal does. And its fader gives you precision control over any parameter your instrument or computer can map expression to. You can also use it with instruments that support Sostenuto to drone a few notes and play on top of them. One of my favorite uses for +3 is as a macro controller for build-ups and drops. Many pedals let you control multiple parameters using their expression input. Same goes for many other synths and desktop production boxes. So +3 might let you add an Octatrack style multi-parameter crossfader to your instrument. And depending on your instrument, you might be able to use the sustain side as a macro toggle as well. It also pairs nicely with semi-modular synths as an attenuator on the expression side or gate control on the right. It's designed for those of us who have a synth, effects pedal, or MIDI controller with expression and sustain pedal inputs and want to unlock what these jacks give access to using a compact desktop-based controller as opposed to using large pedals and feet. We sent one to Heinbach, so it might pair with test equipment. I don't know, we'll find out later in the video. In this video, I'll take a look at how it works and then look at a few interesting pairing ideas for it. A quick disclosure, I am definitely biased in this case. +3 is a collaboration between myself and Endorphins, so this video is sponsored by me. Okay, let's start with an overview. +3 has two halves, each is completely separate from the other electronically. There's the expression fader on the left with its polarity switch and expression jack, and then on the right, the momentary sustain key and the sustain or drone toggle with the sustain jack in the back. It's called +3 because the idea is that it can add up to 3 controls to whatever it is you're connecting it to. +3 comes with 3 cables, a TRS cable for the expression side, that's the cable with 2 black rings on it, then a TS cable for the sustain side with 1 black ring, and a little insert cable for connecting +3 to semi-modular and Eurorack gear. +3 is totally passive, meaning it doesn't require any power to work. It's made of relatively thick aluminum, so it's sturdy, but also light and very portable. And it's important to say it's not a MIDI controller. Rather, you connect it to devices that can then respond to it, and then, among other things, generate MIDI based on how they're set up. Okay, let's take a slightly closer look. The sustain side works with instruments and controllers that have a sustain jack, which is almost every MIDI controller or synth out there, I think. It has 2 controls, a latching toggle and a momentary button. The latching switch has the same effect as putting something really heavy on a sustain pedal. It'll just keep notes sustained. And then the momentary switch will do the opposite of what this switch does. So this is like lifting your foot and putting it back down, releasing the held notes. And the beauty of how it'll work with most controllers is that if you've got a held drone and then play new notes and press the momentary switch, it'll release the old notes and now hold the new notes until you press it again, or just turn off drone mode, meaning release the pedal altogether. And then when the drone toggle is off, the momentary sustain button works just like how you'd use a sustain pedal. Imparting the kind of expression you can only get with a sustain pedal. Now, of course, with the desktop sustain button, you'll need to keep one hand busy by pressing it, so don't throw away your foot pedal just yet. But if you need to enter quick sustain phrases into your DAW or just want a portable sustain button to go, this works nicely. And then for the expression side, beside the fader, +3 also has this little switch up front since there are technically two ways expression pedals can be wired, RTS or TRS. To test if the polarity is working as it should with your synth or controller, you can use free MIDI monitoring software like Show MIDI. The fader should smoothly move between 0 and 127 in a linear way. If it doesn't reach 127 or around 64 in the middle, the switch setting is probably wrong. If you want to use the wrong mode, by the way, you can, you'll just get an exponential response. Regardless, don't forget to calibrate your controller to enjoy the Plus 3's full range. Another reason why this might not be linear is because your controller is configured differently. By the way, if your MIDI controller only has one jack, it still may support expression pedals, for example, even the lower cost ones from Native Instruments like the M32, so you can add a fader to this one as well if you configure the jack to expression. Besides the obvious controls, Plus 3 has a couple of bonus features. First, it uses a standard mechanical key switch, so as lovely as the one we provide is, if you want to swap it out with your own, a tool like this costs about $1 or $2 on AliExpress. With a little semi-non-invasive surgical procedure, you can take this beautiful key out and replace it with something else, and it should work just fine. And then the second hidden bonus feature is a little jumper inside that lets you use the right side, the sustain side, with expression pedals and as a Eurorack gate control. More on that later in the video. Okay, so that's what Plus 3 can do technically. What you can do with it really depends on what you plug it into. Let's take a look at a few use cases and nuances regarding how it works. And I'll start with the sustain and hold side. While many synths and controllers don't have a hold button at all, some that do have hold work differently than sustain. So for example, hold here, what it will do is literally keep MIDI notes on, even if I leave my fingers off the keyboard, and then if I press a new chord, it'll drone that chord. So any new note that I play will disable the previous ones. That's extremely useful for how arpeggiators work and for other creative purposes as well. Sustain works differently. Sustain is a separate MIDI message sent on CC64 on or off, and if I play a note and hold it and then release the note, you can see the note off event has already been sent, but the note is still sustained because the synth I'm using respects CC64, the sustain CC. That means that drone mode here will work differently than hold. Here, I can keep on adding notes to a drone, and they'll all be held indefinitely until I release them. And like I mentioned earlier, if I want to swap all the held notes, a momentary unsustain will do the job. You might find a similar behavior in synths, like Muse for example. When you play a new note, it'll disconnect the old ones, which is definitely a useful option. Alongside that, when you hook up Plus 3 to it and turn on drone mode, and of course make sure Muse's drone mode is off, then as you play notes, they'll be added to the drone. And that will be held indefinitely until, of course, you want to release the drone, and if you want to replace the droned notes, then just press the button, the momentary button, and the new notes will be held. Another interesting thing sustain can do, I think, is enhance arpeggiators. So for example, if we take a normal arpeggiator, regardless of how far we push the gate and even tie the notes, it just sounds different when sustain is held down. It's particularly true, but not just, when using piano-style sounds, because holding the sustain pedal in a proper piano plugin will cause sympathetic resonances in all the undampened strings. Okay, let's move on. Remember that I said that while the default assignment for the sustain pedal is CC64, you might want to change that, and one of my favorites is Sostenuto. Sostenuto is what the middle pedal on grand pianos does. It applies sustain or latches or drones only the notes you hold as the pedal is pressed down. So for example, these notes will ring out, but the other ones won't. This means that I can latch or drone any set of notes I hold as I transition into drone mode, then play on top of those notes that don't hold or don't drone, and then if I want to swap the drone around, press a new drone, momentary release, drone again, and play on top of that, without droning these additional notes. So for this to work, your hardware needs to support receiving Sostenuto messages on CC66, or just allow you to assign the hold input to that, like on Novation Peak, for example. Same goes with Osmos. You don't need to bother with CCs. You can just choose Sostenuto in the settings. One more thing about Sostenuto: if your instrument doesn't respond to CC66 as Sostenuto, you might find a third-party MIDI effect that enables it. I'll link to examples in Ableton Live and other DAWs in the description. This one is a really nice and inexpensive Max for Live device I found for Ableton Live. Moving on, some synths, believe it or not, don't have an arpeggiator latch button. For example, in King Korg Neo, it's hidden behind a few menus. However, if its sustain jack can be mapped to less the arpeggiator, as it can be in King Korg Neo, then +3 can add an ARP latch button to it. This synth, and many others by the way, will let you also assign the sustain jack toggle to control multiple other parameters. And another interesting use case I think for the sustain side is just to map it to any parameter in your DAW. For example, freeze on a reverb. Nothing like an indefinitely held freeze to make my day. And this can be released either momentarily or permanently. One thing to be aware of in this particular use case is you want to remap the CC that this sends to something other than 64 so that it doesn't also sustain notes, unless of course that's what you want it to do. So this can be mapped to a bunch of things, basically another temporary or permanent on-off switch for your setup. So that covers the sustain side. On the expression side of +3, it pairs very nicely with synths, effects pedals, and MIDI controllers that have an expression input. Let's take a look at a few MIDI controller pairings and then move on to hardware. For expression, +3 pairs nicely with controllers that don't have faders, of course, but do have expression inputs, like those by Native Instruments or Keystage by Korg. A fader can give you control of any parameter you want to assign it to, like dynamics on a virtual instrument, or fine control for string instruments. Or if you have a crazy plugin like Beat Fader, using a knob to control it doesn't quite work the same way. So one use case where I think this shines is mapping it to a single parameter that doesn't change regardless of how the other knobs or mod wheel or pitch bend wheel changes. So for example, in the case of this plugin, Transit by Baby Audio and Andrew Huang, I can use the fader to control the transition and change presets with my mouse. So quickly flip through presets and explore which one I want to use without mousing back and forth. And this can be any parameter across my DAW, of course, any single parameter. And then another interesting use I found for +3's fader is to control the last parameter you used. That depends on whether your DAW supports it natively or with an expansion. For example, in Ableton Live, if you've got Suite, there's a free Max for Live plugin called Cosell that will let you control the last parameter you touched with a mouse. So if I go to the previous example, if I click this parameter, I can control it with the fader, but if I go to this one, then I gain control of it with the fader. I just feel much more comfortable controlling parameters with this or even a knob compared to clicking a mouse and dragging up and down. So for those of us who don't like to use a mouse to edit parameters, this is an interesting alternative. Let's move on to expression control in synths with an expression jack. You should always check your synth system menus to see what expression can be mapped to. That's an easy win. One of my favorites is Sostenuto in Osmos and Continuum. So remember how on other synths, Sostenuto is just a switch. On Osmos and on the Continuum, you can control the level of held notes, the level of Sostenuto, with an external expression pedal, or with +3 of course. Another hidden feature I found +3 was able to unlock as I was plugging it into various synths around the house is Aftertouch. Your synth, for example Juno D, may support Aftertouch in its presets, but the keyboard doesn't. If you can somehow send it MIDI Aftertouch messages or just map its control or expression pedal to Aftertouch, then you can get the same timbral changes with a fader. Of course, this is mono Aftertouch, and if whoever designed the synth did a good job, then they'll also send channel pressure messages when you move the fader. Juno D does this, so if you want to use this as a MIDI controller every now and then, you can unlock Aftertouch on other desktop synths you want to control with this, or on a software synth on your computer. Another cool trick, normally Aftertouch isn't relevant when you use an arpeggiator, but here, you can control whatever Aftertouch is set to without ever touching the keys, especially in this case since they don't have Aftertouch. Another nice pairing for +3 is synths that have a joystick that bounces back to the center position, like King Korg Neo or Juno D. If you can map their expression jack to the mod control, you've got expression control that doesn't bounce back. Then beside controlling one parameter, one of my favorite uses for +3's fader is as a macro controller for synths. Meaning using it to control more than one parameter at a time to morph from one sound to the next. Now you could use the mod wheel for that. In TO5 it's mapped by default to vibrato typically. If you don't want to give that up, +3 gives you another fader, and if we look at the mod matrix, for example in this patch, I mapped expression to the sub oscillator, to noise, and to Xmod. Okay, let's move on and talk about effects pedals. If your pedal has an expression or foot switch input and you're using it on your desktop as opposed to with your feet, +3 can probably help it do more. As it did for synths, the basics are exposing control of parameters that aren't available on the panel. For example, the Eventide H9 is one of my favorite pedals, but it doesn't have much in terms of hands-on control. And interestingly, all the pedals I just showed you, plus many from other popular brands like Electro Harmonics, and yes, even those by Endorphins, support using expression as macros for multiple parameters, making +3 an excellent build-up and drop tool. In this jam kindly sent in by Kindsire, +3 is controlling reverb, delay, bit crushing, a bunch of parameters at once. Some instruments have more than one expression input. In this case, you can use +3's expression side for an octatrack-like crossfade between multiple parameters, and also use its sustain side to quickly toggle between multiple parameter settings. On instruments like Analog 4, you can map both sides of +3 to multiple destinations. Ora will be sharing a more detailed look at this setup on his channel. I'll link to it below, but here's a little snippet with just a few of his macro ideas.
So what I did, you can see, I managed to get a track 1. Whenever I push that up, I will open the filter, I will send more reverb and send more delay. And then on track 3, I will open the filter too, and then the effects track, I will push the feedback of the delay. Let's just listen. I will tune down the kick because it doesn't do anything. So this is the bass. So as you can hear, now I have everything going on, like I'm creating a lot of tension. Super cool. And it's super simple to set up. I'll tell you how. Then I also have the sustain pedal, and let's see what it does on Control 2. So this one, it's just like on or off. If I press, you see that it goes to 127. What this does, whenever I press, I decide how much control to send to track 1 reverb, so it sends more reverb. On track 3, it will close the filter. On track 4, it will kill the volume. Track 2, open the filter, and also open a tiny bit the filter on track 4. So basically, it kills the drum. Let's listen. The moment I press, the drum goes away. But as you can hear, with working with the filter and effects on the other track, I create a sort of interesting ducking effect. From here to here.
Okay, moving on, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, you can use both sides of +3 with semi-modular or Eurorack instruments as well. So for example, here I'm using it to control the mod depth of the VCO going into the shift frequency of Spectravox, which is basically the cutoff of all the filters in Spectravox. The expression side is extremely useful as an attenuator to help you control audio or modulation levels. Simply plug your mod source into one side and the destination into the other. Let's try it on something else, say the envelope generator. Here, +3's expression side controls the envelope's mod depth. So that's it for the expression side with modular gear. You can also use the sustain side to cut the flow of audio or CV. We provide one of these to get you started. If you want to use both sides for modular gear, you'll need to get another one. You can then plug in any audio or CV source through this and either temporarily mute it or toggle it on and off. A couple of caveats here. Muting is immediate in this circuit. And that's great for CV, but you might experience clicks with audio. And then a second caveat, the default internal wiring is for sustain pedals, not for the expression type routing that you need for this kind of connection. That means that the signal might not be totally muted or you might experience noise. If that becomes noticeable to you, use the internal hidden jumper inside to move from sustain mode to expression mode on the sustain side of +3. More on this later. Besides using +3 for destinations that don't have attenuators at all, you can also use it for those destinations that have tiny attenuators or attenuverters if you want a little bit more control of what's going on. Just turn the attenuator or attenuverter all the way up, pass a mod source through +3 into the destination, and then use the fader to attenuate mod voltage. The switch on the front panel has an interesting effect when using the fader as an attenuator. It'll toggle between a linear response curve and a logarithmic response curve, depending on which of the two jacks you use in the breakout cable and the position of the switch. A good rule of thumb to get a linear response with the fader is to plug the source or mod source into the black tip, and the output goes out the red tip, and you'll get a linear response if this switch is up. If you see all the action happens on the bottom portion of the fader and not much else on the top half, just flick the switch up, and you'll be good to go. This is what a linear response should look like. And then for something completely different, I thought it would be cool if the fader could be used to control two MIDI CCs. One if the sustain is down, and another if it's up. I reached out to Floyd Steinberg and he kindly agreed to write a web MIDI script that does just that. This is a simple script that runs in a web MIDI capable browser like Chrome and works in the background as long as your browser is open. The idea is that it takes the flow of messages sent from the pedal and lets you forward the pedal's CC to one CC if sustain is up and another CC if sustain is down. There is one more thing that needs to be running in the background. You'll need to enable an IAC driver bus device on a Mac or use Loop MIDI on Windows, and then forward MIDI from your synth to the IAC driver or to Loop MIDI, and then in your DAW, make sure to pick up the MIDI from the IAC driver. Don't forget that +3 is still causing sustain messages to be sent. That's what the option to filter those out is for. And you can choose to forward all other MIDI to the new port as well. I know it's a silly little script, but I love it, and you can use it with a regular sustain pedal too, so hopefully this helps people who don't have +3 as well. Okay, to wrap up +3, let's talk about its hidden jumper. Before we wrapped up the design of Plus 3, we decided to add just one more feature. And to access it, you need to take Plus 3 apart very gently. The procedure is pull the fader off, and then you've got to undo 3 screws. The one on top, and then the 2 on the sides, which will let you access the hidden jumper. That's this one here. The factory default is that the jumper isn't connected to anything. You can also take it out, but don't lose it. And then you connect the center pin to either the right or left pin based on whether you want a TRS or RTS connection. So just join 2 pins together. And that's basically it. Put it back together. You can use this little fader stick to align the screw. Insert the 2 side screws. And put the fader cap back on. So there's one more thing. Will it work with test equipment?
Hi Ziv, you wanted to know if Plus 3 works with test equipment. And I can say, it does. You have to go a bit into adapter hell. So I'm using the cable that came with it. And I've got a mini jack to BNC cable here from the output of this WaveTech generator. And this allows me to use the momentary switch to play this oscillator, which is a lot of fun. And I'm running the fader to the Chase Bliss mood to control the clock, which allows me to do old school pitch shifting effects. This is really handy. Congrats to you and Endorphins.
Thanks, Heinbach. And then just 2 hours before this video is set to go live, I get a video message from David Allen from Roland. We had sent him the pedal to test with their gear, and I just had to ask his permission to include it as yet another pairing idea for Plus 3. Here goes.
Obviously the normal kind of control message or pedal message works fine. So as you probably know, you can assign the hold pedal in the Juno D. I mean that this goes for most of our products, but you can assign it to anything and not just hold. So in this case, I've actually assigned it to cutoff frequency. So it just turns into a binary, like kind of like, I guess, when you put a gate signal into a CV input for a filter or something. It's just a full or like 0 to 0 or 127 basically. So we get this with a cutoff. I love it. So we can do some, I don't know, like Prodigy, Tom Morello. This is like the Tom Morello of synths. So let's put a beat on. And then you can just like play with them. So that is a really cool feature actually. And you can, I love it. It's super cool. It's such a cool thing.
So that's it for Plus 3. I'll put a link to a playlist of extra content about it below, and if you make something nice, please let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to add it. A mega thanks to everyone who participated in this video. You can get Plus 3 directly from Endorphins, or a few of the stores I'll link to below. Thanks for watching.